Hey everybody, welcome back to another video. We are doing our Sunday lesson, and so even if you're not watching this on Sunday, that's okay. But we're continuing on our story of the starting of the nation of Israel, and we are now at the point where Jacob's son Joseph is the key character in our study. And so we're going to be continuing his story today, and we're going to be looking at Genesis chapter 39 through chapter 41. Again, we're not going to read all of these verses. We'll tell the story, and then what I would encourage you to do is to read the whole chapters. But we'll be referring to the Bible a little bit as we go through the story today. But before we do, we're going to be singing a song, and today we're going to be singing the song Happy Day. So check that out, and we'll be right back here in just a few moments.
Death is beaten, you have rescued me. Sing it out, Jesus is alive. The empty cross, the empty grave, a life eternal, you have won the day. Shout it out, Jesus is alive. He's alive. And oh, happy day. Happy day, you wash my sin away. Oh, happy day, I'll never be the same. Forever I am changed. When I stand in that place, free at last, meeting face to face. I am yours, Jesus, you are mine. Oh, in this joy and perfect peace, earthly pain finally will cease. Celebrate, Jesus is alive. He's alive. Oh, happy day. Happy day, you wash my sin away. Oh, happy day, I'll never be the same. Oh no, forever I am changed. And oh, what a glorious day. What a glorious way that you have saved me. And oh, what a glorious day. What a glorious name. Jesus. Oh, happy day. You wash my sin away. Oh, happy day, I'll never be the same. Happy day, you wash my sin away. Oh, happy day, I'll never be the same. No, forever I am changed by your blood, by your grace, oh God. I'll never be the
All right, hey, welcome back. Hope you enjoyed the song. We're going to be looking again, like I said, in Genesis chapter 39, the story of Joseph and what happens. Now, in our last lesson, we learned that his brothers really didn't like him. They were jealous of him. They were frustrated with him. And they sold him to some traders, and they took him down to Egypt. And then that's where he was. And so we're going to be learning about what happens to him today. The thing of it is, it seems like a pretty rough go for Joseph. Here he was, this young man, and he was rejected by his brothers. And his father thinks he's dead, so his father's mourning his death. And he's down in Egypt, in a foreign land, with no understanding of that culture, or probably very little of it. He's with these men who will sell trades and goods and obviously people, because they bought him to sell him there. But the truth is that God doesn't abandon his people during times of difficulty and trouble. If you live long enough, you're going to face trouble. Maybe you never have to this point, and that's awesome. But sometime in your life, you're going to face some difficult things. But know that God is there with you, walking with you through those problems and those difficulties and those situations. And he was with Joseph. And the idea for us today, our takeaway is that we want to love God in spite of our troubles and to keep on serving him faithfully. And that's important, that we learn how to do that even as kids, that we learn that even though we're going to face some tough things sometimes, we still continue to trust and believe in God. That's so important for us to learn as soon as we possibly can and learn to understand that. The verse that I want to read to you that you can check out is from Romans chapter 8, verse 28. And it says, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." God wants to work his will out in our lives, and that he works things for our good. And sometimes when we're going through something really tough, we don't think it's very good. And we think it's bad. We think it's not good at all. But sometimes God uses that later on in our lives to maybe help somebody else, or to teach us something, to help us figure out how not to get in that situation again, or there's just 1,000 different ways God can use that to help us in our lives. And so we want to know that God does work all things in his time according to his plan for our good benefit. He always has our best interest in mind. All right, so let's get into this lesson, and let's take a look at what Joseph is dealing with. Let me read from the Bible, chapter 39. Let me just read a few verses out of chapter 39. Verse 1, it says, "Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him, and he made him overseer of his house, and he put him in charge of all that he had. And from that time he made him overseer in his house, and over all that he had. And the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and in the field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him he had no concern about anything but the food he ate." So it's got to be a very difficult transition. Joseph is rejected by his brothers. He's thrown into a pit. They're plotting on how to kill him. And then these traders come by, these Ishmaelite traders, and it doesn't give us a whole lot of what they were doing, but they must have had trades, like I said, maybe livestock and goods and services, and obviously they didn't care if they sold people either, so they might have been slave traders too. And so he goes from being pulled up out of the pit, being sold into slavery, and sent down to this new unfamiliar place, and then he's sold to an Egyptian captain of the guard. Some might even think that it's possible that he might have been the king's executioner, but he had some position of power in the Egyptian military. And so he's sold to this guy, and he's put into his house as one of his slaves. But the thing is that God is still with Joseph. And when Joseph does his work, whatever this guy requires of Joseph, and he does his work and he works hard, he becomes successful. And Potiphar begins to see this. So he goes from just being in his household, favorite of his father, to being a slave and being in a really tough circumstance. But Joseph doesn't give up his trust in God, right? And so he begins to become successful. So in this very short period of time, his life completely changes, and it's not the life that he had planned for himself or what he was thinking about of his future. He's now in this whole other circumstance, in this whole other situation. And I mean, culture, language, the way people do, the way that things that the people do are different. It's quite possible that there was a different way they prepared food. Everything is different. And plus, he's not a free man. He's a man who is owned by someone else. And so he goes on this journey now, and he's going through all these different things. And so he now moves into this house, helps his owner become very successful. So much so, and he trusts Joseph so much that he just turns everything over to Joseph and his household. He becomes the head person of the household. And it must have been a relatively large household. He must have had some personal wealth. He must have had multiple slaves. And Joseph is this person now who is in charge of all of that. Now, it says in verse 6, now Joseph was handsome and in form and appearance. And that is important because of what happens next. Potiphar gave him complete trust, and he decided, hey, I can trust you with anything. Because he was young, because he was a good-looking guy, people liked him. And Potiphar's wife decided she wanted to have a deeper relationship with Joseph, more than he wanted. He just wanted to do his job. He wanted to honor Potiphar, and she wanted more than that. And so she would come to him, and she kept asking him to be with her. And he was like, no way, not doing it. You are my master's wife, and I cannot disrespect him by hanging out with you and doing whatever. And so he continued to refuse her invitations to come and hang out with her. And so finally one day, he was by himself in the house, and she saw him, and she physically went and grabbed him and said, come hang out with me. And he said no, and she grabbed him by his outer garment, and he shucked off the outer garment, and he ran from the house. And when Potiphar came home, his wife was so mad that Joseph would refuse her that she showed him the coat and said, he tried to attack me. He tried to hurt me. He tried to come after me. Well, Potiphar got very enraged and very angry. And he said to him, you have betrayed everything that I've given you. I've given you all of these things. And I've done all of these things. And so she's kept saying, this is how your servant treats me, by trying to attack me and by trying to hurt me. And it made him very angry. And so he took Joseph and he threw him in jail. Now, here's the crazy thing. He had gotten to know Joseph. He'd gotten to know Joseph. And he knew that Joseph had integrity. He wouldn't have put him in charge of his entire household had he not. And then this happens, and it's so out of character of Joseph, but yet he can't see that for whatever reason. Maybe he knew the truth, but he couldn't bring dishonor to his wife. And so he throws him in jail. And my guess is that his household was not the same after Joseph was thrown in jail. And so now Joseph's in jail, and you're thinking, Joseph might be thinking, here I am, this young man, I've spent some time down here, I've learned the language, I've understood how things are supposed to work. I've managed a household, I've brought prosperity to this household. This woman betrays me, and now I'm in jail, and what did I do to deserve this? Nothing. So now he's in this prison in Egypt. And so he's there, and he could have been super frustrated. He could have said, God, what are you doing? First of all, my brothers hate me. They were going to kill me. They threw me into a dry well, an empty pit. Then they sold me to these traders who sold me into slavery. I went and I've honored you this whole time. I've kept your word. I've followed you. I've made this man's life much better. And become the word of his wife, I am now sitting in jail. A false word. I'm falsely accused. And so there he is. And he has nothing but God. And so God continues to try to work in his life. And remember what that verse in Romans 8 says. God works all things for our good according to his purpose. And so he's doing that. Now, we see that he goes and he gets thrown into prison. But in verse 21, it says, "But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. And whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. And the keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed." So he goes into the prison. The head of the prison, guy you would probably say the warden of the prison, the keeper of the prison, saw something in Joseph that made him different than all the other prisoners. And he saw that this guy had integrity and honor. And he didn't know what, I imagine as he got to know Joseph, and this just didn't happen in 5 minutes, okay? So this takes time. And we don't really, sometimes when we read the Bible, we don't really understand how much time is passing. But you had to imagine this took a long time for Joseph to build a rapport with this prison warden, right? Because first of all, he's a foreigner. First of all, the captain of the guard has brought him in and thrown him in jail and said, "This guy tried to hurt my wife." So he already has a preconceived idea of who Joseph is. But then, as Joseph continues to be in the prison and he, it says that God was with him and everything that he did was successful, he begins to see that what Joseph is and who he is based on his actions and his character and his words is not the guy that Potiphar brought in, that Potiphar said he was. He's a different person. And so he begins to put him in charge of things. And before you know it, he's in charge of all the prisoners in that prison. I don't know how big it was. I don't know how many prisoners there were, but he was in charge of them. Okay? And it's making the prison run smoothly, and God is blessing him as he continues to do these things. And so he's there for a period of time. And it says sometime after this in verse 1 of chapter 40, sometime after this, and usually that might mean even a few years, it says that the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against the Lord their Lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with the two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the prison where Joseph was confined. So we have this commonality. It says that he was put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard. Is that Potiphar? Is Potiphar still in this picture? It could be that Potiphar was still around. So the jailer knew Potiphar probably pretty well, especially being the captain of the guard. And again, if he's the executioner, he would be around prisoners. And when prisoners would be sworn, when they were supposed to be executed, this guy, possibly Potiphar, would be the executioner, or at least in charge of those executions. And so you have to think about the irony of all these things as the keeper is seeing how good Joseph is. Potiphar's still around. He's still possibly there, and he's watching what's going on, and he sees that the prison is running very smoothly and it's under the charge of Joseph. And there's a good possibility that Potiphar is realizing his mistake. But at this point, he's got to save face, and I mean, he's a Hebrew slave, so big deal, right? But he sees that, there's got to be something going on there. Anyways, these two guys end up in prison. They've committed some offense against the Pharaoh. And so they go to jail. And so they're in there, and Joseph's overseeing all the prisoners, and so he has contact with these two guys. And it says, "In one night they both dreamed. the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, each his own dream, and each dream with its own interpretation. And when Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they both were troubled. And so he says, so he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in custody in his master's house. And why are your faces downcast today? So he goes in, he sees these guys upset, and he turns to the guys and he's like, why are they upset? And they said to him, we have had dreams, and there was no one to interpret them. And Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me. So the chief cupbearer told him his dream. And he says, in my dream, there was a vine before me, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and the clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. Then Joseph said to him, this is its interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand as formerly when you were his cupbearer. Only remember me when it is well with you, and please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, so to get me out of this house. For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should put me into the pit. When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was favorable, he said to Joseph, I also had a dream. There were 3 cake baskets on my head. With the uppermost basket, there were all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating it out of the basket on my head. And Joseph answered and said, this is the interpretation. 3 baskets are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat the flesh from you. And on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all his servants and lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted him. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. And so, the story's pretty straightforward. He interpreted these 2 dreams, and those 2 dreams are fulfilled. Cupbearer gets restored to his position. The baker is executed. Pretty tough road for that baker for sure. So the cupbearer had a very important role in the life of a king. The cupbearer made sure that the king's life was always protected from being poisoned, made sure that anything that was brought before the king was not poisoned, or there wasn't going to be anything that was going to make him sick. And so he was like a bodyguard, and he protected Pharaoh. And so Joseph interprets the dreams and says, hey, when you get back to the Pharaoh, please plead my case before him and let him know that I've done nothing wrong and I should not be in this jail. And so what does the cupbearer do? He totally forgets about Joseph for a long time. And so, again, Joseph continues to do what he's doing there in the place that he's at, and he doesn't hear from the cupbearer for 2 years. So we know that Joseph was probably 17 or 18 when he ends up in Egypt. He probably spent several years with Potiphar in order to get up to the rank that he got to. So now it's been several more years that he's been in this prison. And so this time goes by. If we look over to chapter 41, it says, after 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed a dream that he was standing by the Nile. And behold, there came up out of the Nile 7 cows, attractive and plump, and they fed in the reed grass. And behold, 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came up out of the Nile after them, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. And the ugly, thin cows ate up the 7 attractive, plump cows. And Pharaoh awoke. What a crazy dream, right? I mean, I've had some crazy dreams in my lifetime. That's just odd. I'm sure you might have had a crazy dream too. And sometimes dreams they don't seem to make a whole lot of sense. So this dream, for whatever reason, and this is probably not the only dream Pharaoh's ever had, but this one stuck with him. For some reason, this was very disturbing to him, and he knew that this was not just a normal dream in some way, shape, or form. So what does he do? He calls all of his wise men and brings all of these people in, and he sent, and it says he sent. So in the morning his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. And he tells them of the dream, and nobody can interpret the dream. And so he's very angry and frustrated. And then it says in verse 9, the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, I remember my offenses today, when Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard. We dreamed on the same night, he and I each having a dream with its own interpretation. A young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. And when we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation for each man according to his dream. And as he interpreted to us, so it came about. I was restored to my office, but the baker was hanged. The Pharaoh then sent and called Joseph, and they got him out of the pit, and they brought him in. So even though he was in charge of everything, he still was living in pretty deplorable and terrible conditions. And so they bring him up, he comes up, and he comes to Pharaoh, and they probably cleaned him up and prepared him to be in front of Pharaoh. And Pharaoh says, here's my dream. And so he tells him the dream of the 7 healthy cows and the 7 sick cows. And so Joseph says, well, here's the interpretation of the dream. And he says that Egypt would have 7 years of good, healthy crops, that there would be a time of plenty and bounty for 7 years. And then after the end of those 7 years, there was going to be a major famine, and they were having 7 bad years. And so people would suffer, and people would get really hungry, and they wouldn't be able to provide for their families. And it would be devastating to Egypt and the surrounding nations. It was going to be a terrible, horrible time. And so he advised the Pharaoh to put somebody in charge of the land, and basically set up a system that would take a certain amount of the things of the crops from all of the regions, and set things aside so that in the lean years, in the famine years, there would be food and there would be plenty for the nation of Egypt, for the country of Egypt, for the Egyptian empire, if you will. And Pharaoh liked the idea so much that he said, you're the man to be in charge of everything. You interpret the dream, you know what to do. I want you to be in charge of it. And so that's where he got put into a place. It says this. It says that the proposal in verse 37 of Genesis 41 pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find a man like this in whom is the Spirit of God? And then Pharaoh said to Joseph, then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards to the throne will I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I've set you over all the land of Egypt. And he took his signet ring, which was the way he would sign documentation, from his hand, and put it on Joseph's hand, and he clothed him in garments of fine linen, and he put a gold chain around his neck, and he made him ride in his second chariot. And they called out before him, bow the knee. Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no one shall lift up hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphenath-Paneah, and gave him in marriage Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On. So Joseph went out over the land of Egypt, and he was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh the king. So here's what we see that happens. Joseph goes from being a dream teller to his brothers, and they're full of jealousy, into a pit, throwing him into a pit, selling him to these Ishmaelite tradesmen who sell him to Potiphar. Now you got to believe that if Potiphar had a position of power that he had, he sees all this stuff happening to Joseph. He sees the success of his own house. He sees his wife destroy that by throwing Joseph in jail or by taking that opportunity away from him. And then he's still around. So Joseph's about 17, 18 when all this stuff begins. So it's about 12 or 13 years that Joseph spends as a slave and then as a prisoner. And then he goes before Pharaoh, the mighty empire of Egypt, the leader of all of Egypt, people who looked at him and thought of him as divine, and says, Joseph's interpreted this dream to me. I understand it. And now I know what we're supposed to do. And he's giving us advice on how we handle this situation for the next 14 years. I'm putting him in charge of everything. And so Joseph now at 30 years old is the second highest ranking person in all of the Egyptian empire. He's given a wife. He's given a place to live. He's given all of these different things. And now he's over Potiphar. He's over the jailer that had the warden of the prison. He's in charge of those guys. So he went from being their servant and subservient to them to now being ruler over them. And you know, we don't ever read anywhere in the Bible that he ever does anything to Potiphar, that he ever goes back to Potiphar and his wife and does anything to them. He leaves them alone. Can you imagine what Potiphar was thinking and how he was feeling and how his wife was thinking and feeling? Now he's this guy of authority and power, and they have to serve him. And how is this going to work out with his brothers and his mom and his dad in the future? Well, we'll have to check that out on the next lesson. The point of we want to get across to us is, you and me, we may not rise to the highest power in the land. We may never become the president or the vice president or whoever the second most powerful in charge person is of our country. But God desires to work out our best for us in our lives, even when we face adversity. 12 years he was a captive in some way, shape, or form. At least a minimum of 12 years. And yet, God did not forsake Joseph. God put him in the right positions, in the right place, at the right time to literally save not only the Egyptian empire, but also the Hebrews, also the Israelites. Those, and that will be coming in the future, and we're going to talk more about that in the coming lessons. But for you and for me, God desires our best every time for us because we have a relationship with him, because he loves us and he cares about us. And we need to see that. We need to embrace the stuff that comes into our life and trust that God's going to do great things through that. All right, let's pray. God, thanks so much for this lesson of Joseph, and God, how he listened to you, how he followed you even in great times of frustration and stress and fearfulness. He could have been afraid all the time because he didn't know what was going to happen to him. And everywhere he was put, you brought him success. And he understood that. He acknowledged that's where everything came from. And so even in the tough times of being a slave and being a prisoner, he still trusted you. And God, you rewarded him for that by placing him in a position of authority to help others, to point people to you. It wasn't just about himself. It was about giving you the praise and the glory and the honor. And that's what we do in our lives. When you put us in those positions, we can share our testimony, our good news of how God blesses us. And so I pray that we would take some good small things away from this lesson today, that we know that you have our best interest in mind, that even though we face some tough times, we can come through those tough times on the other side and see how you are using us and how we have been blessed by you. Thank you so much for this lesson. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, ladies and gentlemen, you have a great week, and we will see you on the next video.